It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Hello and welcome to this Halloween edition of Tuesdays with Lyndsey. I am Lyndsey. This is RealAg Radio. And did you know Halloween is probably my least favorite holiday? I don't even know what we call it. Is it a holiday? My kids love it. Today they're going as Samwise from Lord of the Rings, as a beautiful fairy, and as Mariposa Barbie. And I'm not going to tell you who's going as which. You guys can guess. And I'm glad the kids love it. And I see people dressed up, and I just think, good for you. But maybe I am very boring. Perhaps I am just a stick in the mud. But all the scary, ghouly stuff that I just, thumbs down. Anyway, I can maybe get behind, the candy? I don't know. All right. Okay. So let's get to today's show. Before you head out trick-or-treating or completely stuff your face full of sugar, we've got a great show. And there's a couple things going on that I do want to talk about. But first, on today's lineup, you're going to hear fascinating discussion with Nick Dubuc and Marla Riekman. Marla's with Manitoba Ag. Nick is a farmer out of Quebec. You might recognize that name from the Farmer Rapid Fire. He's also an ag engineer. And last night on the Agronomists, we had a great discussion about tires versus tracks and compaction in general, and some of the surprising ways we are compacting soil. We focus so much on the harvest season, and for good reason. Combines are super heavy, and so are carts, buggies, depends on what you call them. But there's certainly the opportunity for compaction at planting and at seeding, and we probably don't talk about that enough. So that's definitely on the discussion. So I pulled some of that. And then we've also got Deb Stark. Now, for those of you who don't know, Deb, she's a former Deputy Ag Minister for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and she sits on several different boards and sort of in her next phase of her career. And I really admire Deb. I've had a conversation with her on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast about mentorship, super important. But I wanted to talk about governance. And before you plug your ears and if you've ever been part of any sort of board, produce group, whatever, and you've been frustrated by, things not getting done or someone trying to steamroll everybody or just, a group that's not clicking, governance is really the backbone of how you move things forward when people don't agree. And so I wanted to talk to Deb, and she said yes. So I'm super thrilled about this, about good governance, about how we reach consensus or make decisions in a group setting, and why governance is so important. And if you're interested in, serving on a board, how do you start? So we have that conversation too. I've also got Jeanette Gaultier is going to join the show with Kara Oosterhuis to talk about verticillium stripe in canola. Definitely one of those ones that, and you'll hear Jeanette talks about how this is possibly a disease that's been around longer than maybe we thought, and we've maybe been misdiagnosing it. So some really interesting things there to talk about as well. Now, before I head to a break, and there's one other thing I want to talk about today, and I want to put this question out to you and would love your feedback. You can, of course, zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com, or call that feedback line, 1-855-776-6147. But there's been two pieces of information that have come across my desk in the last little bit. We're pretty used to hearing about, company consolidation, one buying another. We're pretty used to, we've got a big grain merger in Canada potentially happening, and around the world, of course, with Bunge and Viterra. But we've had two pieces of news. So Combine, this week, we heard Bayer's Climate Field View, their software platform, is fully integrating with Combine. Now Combine Ag was bought a little while ago, and so now they're going to offer essentially a full integration between the two, where the platforms can fully talk to each other, and sort of put together your field software, your field data into your marketing data, and sort of link the two of them. that's the first one. The second one, or the one that happened last week, was a partnership being announced between Decisive Farming and GrainFox. GrainFox, formerly known as Farm Lake Marketing Solutions. You hear from GrainFox advisors here on the show often. Great people. And so this is a link, and I'll also note that Decisive Farming now owned by TELUS, so there's all sorts of acquisitions going on here. But they're linking up together as well. And Farmer Jim, my brother from another mother out in Saskatchewan, Jim Hale, he asks the question, what problem does this solve in both cases? And it's a good one. And this is where I'd love your feedback, is that from the perspective of the farmer, because of course, I think I recognize where from the company's perspective, where this might solve some issues for them. But I'd love to know from the farmer perspective, where something like this, like the integration of platforms, if you're finding value in it, if you are making use of some of these platforms and you like to see where they're working together more, not less, and if it solves a problem for you. So that's one of the questions I have as well. Okay, so without further ado, I've rambled on long enough. Let's head to a break, and I will be back with a discussion with Deb Stark on good governance right after this.
What's next for your fields? At Pioneer, delivering industry-leading genetics drives everything we do. From the scientists in the lab to our local teams with boots on the ground, we are determined to get there first. Developing top-performing products, proven in more growing conditions than ever before. Pioneer. What's next happens here. Visit pioneer.com/Canada to learn more.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on this Tuesday, October 31st. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and as promised, it's time to have a discussion on good governance. All right, to have this conversation about good governance, I'm joined now by Deb Stark. She's a common name to many here in Ontario, but for those who maybe don't know Deb Stark, she's an independent board member, let's put it that way, serving with the University of Guelph, Ontario Genomics, and most recently with the Canadian Agricultural Policy Institute. Welcome here, Deb.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, Lyndsey. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, this is, as Rob Stone calls it, he's a farmer out of Western Canada, pointy shoe season, which is meeting season, which is, board meetings. Yes, they happen all year, but especially in agriculture, we do a lot of lobbying, a lot of policy meetings, and this time of year also gets me thinking about the rules, the regulations, the courtesy, the unspoken rules about all of these things. But there's also the very important part of how any group works, a producer group or other board, and that's good governance. What is governance, and what does good governance look like?
Well, there's a lot of fancy definitions, and the word gets thrown around quite a lot, but I think it really is just the way in which your group of people are making your decisions and working together. I think of it, it's a lot like kind of on your own farm. If you're by yourself, it's easy to know. You can make your decision and you're done. If you've got other partners involved with you in your farm business or any other business, then you really need to figure out who has the authority to make those decisions and how those decisions are going to be made, and it needs to be clear to everyone. So governance, that's kind of what it's like. Farm organizations are basically the same, but they're even more complicated than any family business because you've got, in a lot of cases, you've got these district representatives, and they are kind of set up that they all have an equal voice at the table, and they need to figure out, how to get things done. And the other challenge around some of the farm organizations, especially the regulated ones, if it's a not-for-profit organization, if it's your local charity and you don't like the way it's being run, you just don't support them anymore, right? Mm-hmm. But if it is your regulated farm organization, you don't have any choice. You need to continue to fund them. So the pressure is really on to make sure that the decision making is clear and things get done, promises are kept. And I guess the second part about why it's important, two reasons, I think. One is, as I say, to get the work done, move the organization forward, and through the organization, move the sector or whatever you're responsible forward, and watch out for pitfalls and risks and help people avoid it, and just basically make sure that you're reacting and proactive, both sides of the coin, in a very complicated world. And to do that, you also need to maintain the confidence of the members, and that's linked. So if your members don't think you're making any decisions, you're getting things done, they're going to lose a lot of confidence in you.
So, and that's so many key things pop out to me in this, and one of them is exactly that. And I'm glad you sort of started with that. Is there are decisions that have to be made, and they range from very small to very large. And when we think about a producer board or something like that, where they are going to make decisions based on their membership's behalf, you have to have a framework where everyone understands this is how we get to decision making, and this is what happens once a decision is made.
Exactly.
Right.
This is who. Yep. This is who's going to make the decision, and this is how the decision is going to be made, and then what's going to happen afterwards.
And so, the other part of that, for sure, is that you mentioned is the confidence of the membership as well. You're right. There's significant differences between, if this is a company you do business with, let's say, or, own shares of in something, or if this is this has to happen. This is your producer board. This is, there's law that enacts these things. You don't really have a choice. And so, how important is good governance when it's not necessarily all sunshine and rainbows, which a lot of times it's not. There's conflict often. How does good governance help you navigate that?
Yeah. And that's absolutely right. And one of the reasons you have these organizations with so much, you have a board and you have different people around the table, is you want different perspectives. So you do want the debate and the discussion, because hopefully that's going to lead you to a better decision in the long run. What you kind of want to watch is when the debate and the discussion kind of falls over into out-and-out conflict and things get personal and people get kind of locked into their positions. So this is, again, where the good governance about how an agenda, a subject can be brought to the table. Often someone has to say they want to talk about something, but you often need a seconder. So you need a mover and a seconder. At least two people have to agree. Sometimes you have in policies, here's how long we'll discuss. Sometimes and then here's how the decision will be made in the end. That just helps you see the path forward so that things can happen. Because quite frankly, if everybody agrees, you really don't need a whole board. You just need one person. Those discussions probably aren't even coming to a board. That's probably something your general manager or your executive director is able to do. It is when there is no one right answer. There's pros and cons of two or three different ideas, and you really need the collective conversation to figure out which path your organization is going to take. So it's how you're going to get there is critical.
Right. And so when I think about that, when I think about, the Robert's Rules of Order, or there has to be a motion and it has to be seconded. Like, I think sometimes we take for granted that that's just, you do it because it's prim and proper, whatever. But this is a reason. This is the framework to spell out how a conversation is going to have and how we're going to get to either consensus or a decision or et cetera. So it is actually critical to follow these steps.
Yep. Yeah. Otherwise, it's kind of chaotic. Otherwise, anybody can just throw out any idea at any time. It's the reason you have an agenda for a meeting. And one of the first things you do usually is you approve the agenda. And then that is everybody saying, okay, we have agreed. These are the conversations we're going to have. Otherwise, it's just a recipe for chaos. And you could have a great discussion, but nothing will necessarily get done. Mm-hmm. So that's what the governance does. It puts that framework around to show you how the decisions are going to be made.
So the next part for me then is yes, okay, so this is why it's so important. And I think anyone who's served on a board or on a, you very quickly get introduced to, how some of these things happen and what a bylaw is and how they can be changed. But there's, there's so many things that and little nuances and things that you have to know and understand. For people who are perhaps interested in joining a board or want to serve, their industry or their commodity, where do you start? Because I feel like, is there room within these groups for mentorship? Is that what a lot of groups are doing? Or would someone be sort of on their own to sort of figure out how to navigate all this?
I'm not intimately involved in a lot of the Ontario farm organizations anymore, Lyndsey, so I can't really tell you specifically what any one of them are doing. But just from what I read and hear in generally, I think there's a lot of interest in encouraging members to step onto boards because people, they're struggling to get people, quite frankly, just to get onto the boards. It's a big time commitment. You end up spending a lot of maybe nights and overnights away from home in meetings and plowing through documents and things at the wrong time of year. So it's a challenge. So I think most of the organizations are interested. Anybody who in their own individual sector, I would encourage them to reach out and ask, do you have a mentorship program? How do you get involved? Often my experience is you can start at a committee level. So maybe not be right on the board, but they'll have a committee working on a particular file. Also, talking to existing board members, your district representative, or your local, someone who's involved in the local board can help you. Some of the more local boards, I think, are good stepping stones. So your local ag society, really good place to start. Your local church. If you're, have children in sports, just even being involved in whatever kind of organization they be involved with. It doesn't have to be all ag. I mean, one of the things is this kind of stuff, this need for governance and understanding the process. And as you say, knowing what a bylaw is versus a policy and things like that. Those happen in many places, so it doesn't just have to be agriculture. So if you start locally, you can often get a taste, and then you can get involved in some of the provincial and even the national organizations.
So, but I guess that actually, though, it hits on one of the key points on this whole discussion, is that it can be kind of dry if we just talk governance and rules and order and all those sorts of things. But the crux of it is, to me, some of the people that I know very well and who I've watched them as leaders and as board chairs really get some things done. One of the things they all have in common is they understand good governance and they abide by it and they use it to move conversation forward. So as much as it's perhaps dry, really, if you want to get something done, you have to understand how it moves forward.
Absolutely. And I don't care what organization it is. If you want to get something done with a group of people, if you want to do it yourself, it's fine. But if you want to move a large group of people, especially if they have different interests, you have to have a common language. You have to have a common process to be able to have a conversation and get to a decision. And as you say, get something done. And that's really at the crux of what governance is and how these various traditions have evolved. I don't know. I don't have a historical perspective on, who decided we should have motions and seconders and things like that. But they really have stood the test of time. That's for sure.
See,
the principle that it's got to be more than you that wants to talk about something. That's a good starting place, isn't it?
Realistically, good governance is about making sure that one individual or one idea can't dominate everything. There has to be other people who have been convinced that this is also worthy, and then a clear path forward to bring it forward.
Exactly. And then the oversight to make sure it happens.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So it's another thing, when you think about boards, they have a responsibility for setting the path, but they also have responsibility for making sure that things happen afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we can lose sight of that part of it because it's not usually as much fun and it's not usually as quick or as cheap or the way people think it should happen. And so really watching that and making sure that you're making adjustments along the way, that's an important part of a good functional board as well.
Deb, you've now hit on communications, which is near and dear to my heart. Yeah. So look out. We'll have to come back and have that conversation. All right, Deb, thanks so much for having this conversation with me. It's super helpful. I know it's maybe not the most amazing topic, but really when we get down to it, it's so very important. So I do appreciate it.
It is. There's so many great opportunities for agriculture out there, and the challenge is how do we marshal the forces and get people all lined up in the same direction, and this is one of the tools.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right.
That simple.
Thank you so much, Deb.
Okay.
All right, and with that, we're going to head to a quick break, and I'll hop back on. We're going to hear from Jeanette Gaultier about verticillium stripe in canola, how to identify it, what we need to do about it, and perhaps where it has been dragging on yield.
Whether you're a rookie soybean grower or a seasoned vet, the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com has exactly what you need to stay in the game. The latest research and the best agronomic advice from industry experts, along with local and global market coverage on demand, anywhere, anytime. Make this growing season your best growing season with the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com.
As you look ahead to the next growing season, there's a lot to consider when it comes to your crop. You need every possible advantage available to you. The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com has everything you need to make the best choice for you and your farm. On-demand videos with leading industry experts, available anywhere, anytime. Go into the season confident and ready with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com.
I get to spend every day talking to farmers in the ag industry through RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio. But nothing is more fun than speaking to an audience live and in person. If you're planning an ag event, book a Real Agriculture speaker to make it a successful and memorable experience. Email shaney@realagriculture.com and you can book myself or any other Real Ag personality to speak at your event. Bring your audience all the fun, insight, and energy of Real Agriculture.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Tuesday. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. It is Tuesdays with Lyndsey. I'm having an absolute great time. I hope you are too. If you've got feedback on today's show, you can always call that RealAg listener line, 1-855-776-6147, or find us across social media at Real Agriculture. All right, jumping now to agronomy. If you haven't heard of verticillium stripe and you have canola, it is time to listen up. All right, so you'll hear now from Kara Oosterhuis and Jeanette Gaultier. She's with BASF, and they're discussing the range of verticillium across the prairies, what this might be doing to our canola crop and potential yields, and why it's so important to confirm that that is, in fact, what you're dealing with.
I am now joined by Jeanette Gaultier, who is with BASF, based out of Manitoba. How's it going today?
Good. Noe, we're good.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're here today to talk about verticillium. We've talked about it in the past, but let's just take a quick step backwards here. What is verticillium?
It's funny you said we've talked about it in the past, because we still talk about it being a new canola disease, and relatively it is. It's a new canola disease to Western Canada, to all of Canada actually, for canola growing regions. It's very specific to brassica species. So for us, the big one is canola. Again, not really new because it was first detected in Manitoba about 10 years ago now. Not quite, but almost there. But that said, we often focus on Manitoba, but it is spreading. So we do find it other areas, and I think for other areas it is newer. But I still think it's fair to use that terminology because it is new in some respects that we're still learning a lot about it, even in Manitoba. Like we have so much to learn about this disease compared to something like blackleg or clubroot, for example. So something that we do know about it, though, is its life cycle. So it's soil-borne disease. It starts early in the season, penetrates through the roots, and then grows upwards through the stem, through the water pipes of the canola. And then it does take the entire season to complete its life cycle. And then you'll start to see those microsporotia we talk about, the little pepper on the outer stem, which can shed back into the soil, spread with the residue. And then we're just right back at step one, the next spring.
How long can it stay in the soil? Is there any knowledge there?
I think people have said that, again, it's a hard-bodied spore, so it probably has really good longevity. Again, it's so new. We don't have great recommendations in terms of crop rotation, but I would say anecdotally, we do see that same benefit that we would for other canola soil-borne diseases as well. So even though it's long-lived, you're probably not getting rid of it once you have it. Crop rotation is a decent way to manage it.
And can it have a pretty big yield impact on your final yield?
That's $1 million question. And I think the good news is that there is some research being conducted on this. So this is where some of the research dollars go from canola checkoffs. So that's fantastic. Interestingly, anecdotally in Manitoba, we do see some people say in bad years, yeah, for sure, I saw a yield drag. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, one of the things that we do see from verticillium is a premature ripening. So kind of lends itself to yield loss. On the flip side, we've had some really bad years where another one of the effects is that it causes the plants to lodge really badly. And I feel like we flexed off 50 to 60 bushel canola. It's not really different. There's lots of data from Europe where they've been dealing with this disease and oilseed rape for much longer than we have. And they just seem to say that there's variable yield impacts as well.
And you talk about, we often think of verticillium just being in Manitoba. It is really across the prairies. But how do you know if you have it? Like, what does it actually look like?
Yeah, this is a good one. And I completely agree with that statement. I think we often think about Manitoba, and granted, we do have higher pressure here. And then definitely moving into areas like, eastern Saskatchewan and into North Dakota as well. But we know from federal surveys that they have found verticillium, longisporum, in every province except for the Atlantic provinces. So it could definitely be out there. And it's important to know so that you aren't mistaking it for something else and that you are managing, well, what you should be or what you think is out there. So the classic symptoms of verticillium, when you look at a picture, and we have some pictures, is definitely the stem striping. So you get a stem, half of it's green, half of it's turning brown. If you pull that stem out and you clip like you would for blackleg, you're going to see some discoloration across the stem. It's not going to be chunky like it is for blackleg. It'll be more of a all over the stem. Maybe a starburst is sometimes how it's described. It varies a little bit. In areas where verticillium's a little bit heavier pressure, I'd say it can be darker, maybe hard to distinguish the two. And in fact, even just looking at other symptoms, I always call verticillium the chameleon of canola diseases. I just find that it's really good at looking at other things, looking like other things. So especially when you go in earlier in the season. We start to see maybe some of the side branches lightening up. It kind of looks like sclerotinia. Then it starts to turn gray, and you're like, I think I got blackleg. Cut your stem, and you got discoloration. So I am not embarrassed to say that I don't always know what I'm looking at. So I'm a huge proponent, and I would say most folks in the industry are. If you don't know and you're unsure, get it tested. Lots of labs are offering this service now. If you do want to know what it looks like, though, and just hone your skills, I would recommend waiting until 80% seed color change or even harvest, post-harvest. That's definitely the easiest time. And the reason is the stems have definitely started. They've moved on from that brown color. They're probably gray. We're starting to get some of the epidermis is peeling back, and you can see that microsclerosion. We have pictures that you can include. And so that definitely makes it easier to distinguish from the other diseases that are out there.
And we talk about misidentifying quite often, and lots of times it does get misidentified as blackleg. Is there any key standout, this belongs to blackleg and this belongs to verticillium? Is there any giveaway there or not so much?
Yep. And I have a perfect picture for this. It's definitely, that's why I love to wait a little bit longer, because the pycnidia that you get from blackleg on the outer stem, it's more like raised bumps on the outside, a little bit bigger. You tend to get kind of a bleached area around, whereas the verticillium microsclerosia are under the epidermis, peppery. It's just going to look dark. So they do look quite different once you get used to them. And again, the stem cross section, take it with a grain of salt. Again, if you can distinguish them, because sometimes they occur together too. The blackleg definitely is usually more chunky, those triangles that we're used to, whereas verticillium will be all over. But that one's a little bit tougher. I definitely look for the pycnidia and the microsclerosia on the outer stem myself.
Okay. So we did touch a bit on this. Is there any sort of management we can do, though? Research is still early. It's still early on, but if you find it, is there anything we can do?
Nah, so the bad news, there I go, Debbie Downer, is that we're really not at a point where there's any broad industry standards or standard recommendations for management. The good news on the flip side is that there are lots of research dollars. So your canola associations have been listening to you. And if you're interested to see what some of those projects are, you can go to the Canola Council website and check out their research hub. But lots of good things going on for third-party research, and industry also paying attention. This is a big deal for us. And so I would say that like BASF, for example, we've had a pretty intensive research program that's looking at verticillium and canola since 2021. And breeders, for example, are especially looking for tolerances within hybrids. So lots going on. Just have to be patient and wait for results. It's always hard to do.
Absolutely. All right. Moving on. It is time to head to a break, and I will be back with my conversation from last night, or part of my conversation from last night, with Marla Riekman and Nick Dubuc, and we're going to talk about tires versus tracks and the impact on compaction right after this. Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on realagriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Tuesday, October 31st. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and it is time to dig in to tires versus tracks. All right, so first off, we're going to hear from Marla Riekman. This is from last night's episode of The Agronomists, and we are going to hear about why compaction really matters and when it actually is most likely to happen, and the answer may surprise you. And we hear this stat, and I want to just unpack this a little bit. That because sometimes we get this question, I'm sure Pete can share on the word, the question of should you follow the same track at harvest? Should you cut across the field? How important is it, especially if conditions are iffy for compaction, to potentially concentrate it in one area? And we hear this 80% happens in the first pass. So walk me through that. What does that mean for the decisions we make?
Yeah, so the 80% happening in the first pass really comes down to some research that had been done looking at, how much total compaction happens over each kind of continuous track or pass over the same spot. And what they had done is they traveled over it 4 times, the same location 4 times, and they measured the total bulk density or the compaction amount that happened over those 4 passes. And when they assumed, say, the 4th pass to be 100%, just relative to beforehand, 80% of that happened the first time they went across. And then the additional 2, 3, 4 passes got the other 20% up to that 100%. So it really just kind of drove home the idea that when you are in kind of a risky situation where you've got a high potential for compaction, recognizing that one pass does a lot of damage, a lot of potential damage. So when you can travel on those same spots, it really is very helpful. I know when I talk to people about, the grain carts and things, or buggies, depending on where you're from, when we talk about the grain carts, quite often those are crisscrossing the field, right? The combine's usually going straight up and down, but the grain cart's going crisscross. And you can see that impact afterwards based on how it's traveled across the field. But if you go up at least the past combine tracks, and even if you veer off for unloading and then back on the tracks to get to the headlands, that can eliminate a little bit of those extra strips crisscrossing that you see in that image.
Riddle me this one, Marla. What does this mean?
Okay, so I borrowed this from Francisco Arriaga from University of Wisconsin, and it just kind of helps to show the fact we often talk about soil compaction being worst when soil is moist as opposed to dry or wet. And that's because when your soil is usually near field capacity, or as it gets wetter, once all of the pores are kind of fully saturated, that does sort of help to hold the soil in place. Even though you get the big messy ruts, that's messing up soil structure around the surface. But deeper down, if everything is kind of filled with water, it kind of gives a little bit of buffer, because it's all filled with water. It can be kind of muddy and disgusting, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's compacting the same. Whereas if you have this field capacity where all the big pores have drained out of water, they're full of air, and the small pores are filled with water, and the soil is wetted enough that it can slide on itself a little bit more, then basically as you go across the field, you might not see the big kind of impact of the rut, but you still have that compressing that's happening because the soil is slicker, or the soil can move, and then those air pockets, or the big pores filled with air, can actually compress and compact. And so that's where you start seeing that density increasing. So it's sometimes a little bit confusing because we see the big ruts in the really, really wet conditions, but the level of compaction might not be the same. The soil structure damage is there, but the soil compaction might not be the same as when we don't really see the big, deep ruts because we're in that moist condition. And that's often when we're traveling across the field.
Compaction happens at other times, and planting and seeding is one of those times where it certainly can. Especially if we think about, we have gigantic planting units on little bitty tires. Yeah. So Nick, how much compaction is happening at planting?
You do get quite a bit, especially with those center field planters that run on tiny tires, like you said, truck tires that basically will carry 10, 15,000 pounds on, a few hundred square inches. And then you have that soil that's probably been worked in the spring. So it's soft, tires go down, then they're going compact, they're going to affect your infiltration. And I mean, this is, when I look on our side with tracks, this is probably the one application where we've seen there's an actual dollar value. You can pinpoint the yield loss you're getting from that pinch row compaction. Of all the operations happening on the farm, that's the one that we can actually do it. There's been research by Ohio State University has done a lot of work on this, quantifying that yield drag on those pinch rows that happen in the middle section of a corn planter. And it's, you're talking 4, 5, 6 bushels per acre, which can be pretty significant. And again, it's a matter of compromise. You're trying to get as much as possible planted in a small window. So you're trying to carry as much seed as possible and not stop too often. But then the drawback is you end up with that compaction happening in the middle section of your planter. And I mean, I'm talking row crops, but you go out west, you'll have those massive air seeders now up to 1,300 bushels of fertilizer and seed that you're carrying over fairly soft ground. And as a difference to what we have in Eastern Canada on untiled ground, that ground, there's no tiled drainage or anything. So that's a lot of weight to carry. And I would tend to say that spring conditions are probably even more problematic with compaction than fall conditions, because you have the surface can be kind of dry, but it's going to dry out from the top going down the bottom. Whereas in the fall, it's the opposite. You're wetting the top, but the bottom might be drier. So you do have perfect conditions for having that compaction go down the soil profile.
So good. Okay. So yes. Definitely some key discussions here from last night's discussion. So planting, seeding, actually potentially a huge issue for compaction that we don't always necessarily think about. So that was a huge aha moment for me yesterday. Definitely something that, yes, we talk about, but maybe not nearly as much as we should. The other, of course, is that, realistically, when we want to get on the field is potentially exactly when it might be the worst time for compaction. And that's where we're approaching field capacity, but not quite there. So wetter conditions, like very wet. Yes, as Marla said, more soil disturbance, those big ruts, those sorts of things, but not necessarily as much compaction. Okay. There's lots more to cover on this. And in our next segment, we're going to go to a quick break. And in our next segment, I'll have Marla and Nick back, and we're going to talk about those decisions between tires and tracks, where they fit and what some of the benefits are. Because of course, there are trade-offs for both of these, and the tracks definitely seem to be a really great fit on the combine, but can we potentially get the same benefits, that flotation, decreased compaction, if we simply are using better tire technology? So let's have that conversation right after this.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Some farmers say they don't have time. Some farmers say fitness is not for them. Some farmers say, I don't have time to eat right. It's time to start making changes today. Join me, Sean Haney, and Gary Chambers as we cover all things fitness. That's the Fit Farmer Podcast, available on RealAgriculture.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, here on Sirius XM, Rural Radio, Channel 147. It's our last segment of the day, and we are going to continue with our conversation about compaction. And first off, we're going to hear from Nick Dubuc. He's a farmer out of Quebec, and we're going to talk about one of the questions with tires versus treads is road travel and whether or not you really can get that mileage out of those tracks if you're going to have to do a lot of road travel. It's not the way it works. All right, Nick, we got a great question here, or rather an observation. So Kevin Bishop is out in a part of the world that none of us understand, the Fraser Valley, where it is apparently the Garden of Eden and green year round. But Kevin says there's no tracks out there, and one of the observations as to why potentially is the road travel. So one of the considerations certainly for tracks is road travel. So walk me through that. How do we manage the questions about road travel and tracks?
Yeah, so that is usually one of the main reasons why people will stay away from tracks. As soon as you have an operation or a farm structure that requires a lot of travel, just because every one of those rollers that run in the track will cause a flexion. So you have peak pressures, and you will have also deflection of the material that creates heat. The more heat you get, the heat is the enemy of rubber. So the more heat you generate driving down the road, the lesser the track life you'll get. And the other thing is the track will wear out much faster than the tire going down the road. So that's really where you start having to find that compromise between tracks do bring me those benefits in the field for flotation, for compaction reductions in some cases as well. But if I need a manure spreader is a good example, that would be a prime piece of equipment to have tracks on. But unless you can fill it in the field, it doesn't really make sense because your cost of operation is going to be quite high because of the track durability on the road. So that's where you end up with those sorts of compromises. Tracks are not, I mean, they're made to move from field to field on the road, but they're not made for transport applications.
What are some of the we've talked about road speed, but walk us through sort of some of the trade-offs.
Yeah, so basically road speed is one where tracks will obviously have, some drawbacks compared to tires. On the flip side, there can actually, if on a combine where you move from field to field, you don't actually do transport. You do have the advantage that you may end up with better comfort on the road, especially if you have a suspended track system, because you don't have that air chamber that starts bouncing at every crack and every hole in the road. So you end up with more stability, more comfort on the roading aspect. When you get in the field, I'd say ultimately the compaction action days, they kind of showed that it's possible to get tires that will get a similar performance to tracks. To me, it's how do you want to reduce compaction? Do you want to reduce, even if you achieve the same pressure, the same level of compaction with the tracks and with the tires, do you want to cover more ground surface? Or do you want to keep that compaction in a narrower footprint? And that's where tracks will probably give you an edge, because you'll have that 36-inch wide footprint that's compacted in the field versus having dual tires where you can pretty much assume that the space between the tires will also see compaction. So you end up with the same level, but more surface in the field that's compacted. So those are some of the aspects to look at when it comes tracks versus tires on equipment. And like I mentioned earlier, we're getting to the point where it's hard to even put big enough tires on a combine. Putting 710s or 800s, that's starting to be big even for these equipment. You'd need to add a second axle to a certain extent to be able to get all that weight down. But you don't have that choice. And then putting those really wide tires and dualing them makes the machine extremely wide, which is not necessarily a huge concern in some regions, but you get into more urban areas of Eastern Canada. It's getting hard enough to move equipment as it is. The wider you make it, the harder it gets. So, and I guess the last point I would point out is either configuration, you look at tires or tracks, the one part that seems to be forgotten by everybody is the rear axle. They've added tracks, they've added better tires at the front and at the rear as well, but that weight is not all happening on the front axle. There is quite a bit of weight. Warren, who's with us, Warren Schneckenberger, he's got his Lexion combine on TerraTrax, but I remember him telling me putting a central tire inflation system on the rear axle made the combine completely different. Because now, you go from a track machine where your rear axle is the limiting factor to you're eliminating that limiting factor, and you're actually making that ground pressure at the back similar to your track system or the good tires you would invest in on the front axle. So it's really important to look at everything on the machine.
Marla, when we're trying to put all this together, and there are a few other questions we'll get to, but when we're trying to put this all together, where do you, and as you've hosted some of these compaction events and these sorts of things as well, where are farmers making, sort of the first steps to trying to significantly decrease their compaction on their farm?
We're seeing it with trying to go to, flotation tires, things like that, trying to make a little bit less overall impact. You'd like to see more of that, but tires are expensive too. And so, making those moves, it takes some deliberate planning. We see the tracks. We don't always see essentially as big, in some of the data that we've seen anyway, as big of an impact on the tracks versus tires if your tires are properly inflated, and duals and things like that. So, but that, like I said, that we've talked about that already that has a whole other kind of issue to it as well. A little less slippage and things that we often see in our clay soils with the tracks, and people really like them that way. And I think just being a bit more deliberate on how we're traveling over the field is kind of that next step. Like I often talk to people, again, because we talk so much about it in fall, but it's when you're going to be in that really crappy fall and everybody's stressed out and you've got to make a plan, and the grain cart might be one of the bigger, problems and culprits when it's this big heavy thing with maybe not as many axles as it should have, in order to keep that from driving it deeper in the ground. And we're driving kind of randomly across the field. Being prepared for that in advance, thinking in advance, having a plan in place, and kind of putting it into action in the years when you don't need it to. So when it's dry, just getting habits formed in terms of how we move a grain cart across the field. Those little tiny tweaks, I think, are important. They're not going to solve all the problems, but I think that they definitely can. We've seen some people move into, controlled traffic farming and things like that too, which then gets you just setting your tracks in the field, and that's the roadbed that you're traveling across. And that can do a lot of good in certain soils as well when you know that you've got kind of high risks. But that in itself is also a big modification to the field, and or to the farm itself. We are seeing more and more people interested in doing it. But in Manitoba, it's still not that super common a practice yet.
All right, we're going to leave it there for today. Fascinating discussion with Marla and Nick. Thank you both for joining me on the Agronomists. That happens every Monday night, except for holiday Mondays, at 8 p.m. Eastern. You can find us at realagriculture.com/live or on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. It all goes live on there at the same time. Check it out if you will. Thank you to all my guests on the show today, to Deb Stark, to Jeanette Gaultier, and of course to Marla and Nick. I really appreciate you joining me. If you've got feedback on today's show, 1-855-776-6147, or send me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. And yes, find us across social platforms at Real Agriculture. I'll be back for the Friday Issues panel. Have a great week until then, and happy Halloween.